How old do you have to be?
Just like Draco.
Well, thanks so much for having me back, and everybody for coming tonight. It's a great night to be here drinking beer, especially Crawford's beer, Crawford's Silver Room. So I wanted to start with a quick little survey. How many of our Atlanta Young Republicans present tonight live in town in Atlanta? Raise your hand. All right. How many of you have children? All right. Good. I don't have to ask the next question. How many of you who live, all right, raise your hand again if you live in town in Atlanta. How many of you know where, if you had a child, he or she would go to elementary school if he was starting kindergarten this fall? Okay. I took a look. So one of the great stories going on in Atlanta right now is the growth of people coming back and living in town. And I live in Buckhead. I think it's good to have people coming back and living in the city and having a lot of great things going on in the city. One of the not so great things going on is the level of success in the school system at APS. Everybody's by this point familiar with the cheating scandal and what happened there. But that really, sometimes I'm afraid, kind of distracts from the bigger problem that we have in the school system. So I took the liberty of picking one major project with which we're all probably familiar with, the Atlanta Beltline. And I went on their series of maps. And I don't mean to pick on them, I just thought it was a good exercise. And I wrote down the name of every school, elementary, middle, or high school, that was depicted on their maps. And I figured, okay, well those are sort of in the Beltline zone, right? We've got all this momentum and building and people moving toward that area, and that's great. And then I checked it against the list that the state put out earlier this year of failing schools. Now, statewide, there are 6% of our schools across the entire state that are defined as failing. And that means they've scored below a certain level for 3 straight years. Of the schools around the Beltline, the traditional elementary, middle, and high schools around the Beltline, 36% of those schools are on that failing list. I compared the scores of those schools to just the schools in the Buckhead cluster, the North Atlanta High School cluster. The average elementary score around the Beltline is about 24% below the average elementary score in the Buckhead cluster. For middle and high schools, it was about 17% below. So the question in my mind is, once those of you in this room and all the people who have joined outside of this room who have joined you in moving back in town do have children, because we know that we're talking about a lot of younger people who are making this move back. What is it going to take to keep you in that part of town once you have children and once they're old enough to go to school? I would say good schools would have to be at the top of the list, right? So we've got to figure this out. This is one thing that Creative Loafing and I agree on, actually. They had an editorial not long ago saying that APS has to get its act together if the population movement back in town is going to be sustainable. Kelly McCutcheon at the Georgia Public Policy Foundation, a lot of you are probably familiar with him. He was the first person I heard who said, we can't talk about live, work, play. We've got to talk about live, work, play, learn. And it's that last key or point that is going to be key to making the other stuff be sustainable in town. So I mentioned the failing schools list. As you're probably also aware, the legislature this past session, passed a constitutional amendment to put on the ballot for next fall, 2016, a measure that would create an opportunity school district. And it's modeled after what was done in Louisiana. It would allow the state to identify, again, what schools across the state, the entire state, are failing, and choose a certain number each year. I think it's up to 20 per year for a total of no more than 100 in at one time, for the state to go in and intervene in and either take it over and put new people in place to run it, convert it in, close it down completely, convert it into a charter school, maybe take a whole cluster of schools that feed together and are geographically near one another, and close them all down and open up a series of schools that might allow kids within those areas to have choices about which school they attend. But one, and I fully support that, along with Charlie Harper, who's over there, and there may be somebody else in the room who was with us on the trip to New Orleans back in February. We went with the governor and some legislators to tour some of the schools that have done this in New Orleans, and saw some great things. I fully support this. I hope everybody will go and vote for it next year. But one thing that I think has gotten us in this place, education policy-wise, is we'll have a big initiative every now and then. Constitutional amendment for charter schools 2 years ago, you may remember. There's one voucher type program for kids with special needs. There's a tax credit scholarship. But what happens is we get one of these programs put in place and we just sort of leave it alone. And we wait a couple of years, we don't really do anything, and we do one other big thing, but in the meantime, these existing programs are kind of stagnating. And I really want to emphasize that when you're thinking about these issues, when you're talking with people about them, and you're talking with your legislators about them, that and we need to be doing this and this and this and this and this incrementally, relentless incrementalism. Do a little bit, do as much as we can this year, come back next year and do as much more as we can, and just keep moving on all these fronts and not rely on these one-time big shots that take us a distance, and they're worth doing, and I'm not saying we shouldn't do them, but we've got to do things in between as well. And when you look at a situation like Atlanta Public Schools, like the schools in the areas I'm talking about, if we're not doing Opportunity School District and more charter schools and reform of the traditional public schools we have and more school choice for the kids who live in those areas, that situation is not going to change, and all the positive momentum we have coming back into the city and creating a lot of exciting things here is not going to last. So I promised I wouldn't talk more than about, well, this much on my own, and John indicated that it might be a good idea to do some Q&A after that, so if I've completely bored you with the education stuff, feel free to ask me about something completely different. We'll start with Ryan.
Well, still on education, but a lot of the Buckhead schools, or the Buckhead natives and residents, they send their children to private school. So what's going to change that dynamic from the people that have moved into Edgewood and just want to send their kid to private school?
Well, I think having good private schools available are part of the equation too, and I think having means for people, or mechanisms for people without the means to send their kids to those schools, that's something we need to do as well, and make sure that that's part of the choice that they have. But I would point out that even though, and I live in a neighborhood in Garden Hills, a lot of people move into that neighborhood either to send their kids to the international school or to the School of Christ the King. And the local elementary school isn't as great as some of the others, but it's still a lot better than most of those other schools that I looked at on that map. So they feel that competitive pressure. They do a lot of things to try to recruit kids. They've just had their first charter school open up on the north side of town last fall, which my son attends. And I think that's another thing that's putting pressure on the traditional schools to say, hey, we've got to respond to what parents and kids are looking for. And so even though not all of those schools would rank in the top 10 in the state or anything, they're doing a lot better than other parts of town. And if we could get if we could get the schools across town to be as good as those schools, we'd be in great shape.
So if you do live in town and you have talked about elementary schools, it seems like there actually are a lot of good elementary school options for students. When you get into middle school and there's not as many, but there's still some. Then you get into high school and there's hardly any in the Atlanta area. So why do you think that that's happening? At a certain point in your child's education, you're deciding to go to public school as an option.
You do get some, the question, if everybody couldn't hear, is why in town you see better elementary schools than middle schools and better middle schools than high schools, and why is that the case? You do get a lot of families that will send their kids to those good elementary schools and then take them out and send them to private school when they're starting in middle school or high school, and I think that's probably part of it. I'm not an education expert, so I'm not going to pretend to know all the factors there. You have smaller attendance zones for elementary, and you pool together a few elementary schools to go to a middle school, and then you pool together, maybe a couple middle schools for a high school. So I think you're broadening the population that ends up in those schools is another part of it. But I think that's also an opportunity. I think that a really creative approach to this problem would be to say, okay, maybe we shouldn't focus as much on the elementary schools. Maybe we should focus on choice schools within the school district at the middle school or high school level. You see that in some districts with like magnet programs and that kind of thing. But yeah, I think there could be a lot more of that, and high school kids are probably a little more mobile than younger kids, and so some of the logistical and transportation problems you might run into might be somewhat lessened, and so I think there's an opportunity there, but it's definitely the case that you see that pattern.
Kyle, you talk about the economic impact on the larger community and even the state. So those of us who don't have kids yet, or don't have kids at any point in our lives, or we're not affected directly by those schools, we don't live in those communities, or our schools are good in our area. What's the larger economic impact?
Well, obviously, it's a huge competitiveness issue for the state and for the economy, and being able, if you talk to the people who recruit companies to the state, or who talk to existing companies in the state about expanding, the first thing they typically ask about is workforce. Do you have the available workforce that's ready to be trained, capable of being trained, has that base of education that we're going to be able to work with? And that's only going to become more important. We've all heard about the knowledge economy and how more, the X%, I don't remember the exact number, but X% of jobs that kids in school today will have haven't even been dreamed up yet. The things that they'll do, we don't even know what those things are yet. So you've got to get this part, this basic fundamental education part right. Even as you say, even if they're not your own kids, you want to see your neighbors' kids, the people who live around you and across the state, getting that base of knowledge and education preparation so that industry does want to be here. And I'll say too, there's a transportation piece to this, I believe. When you look at the city of Atlanta specifically, you could argue that the number one transportation problem we have is people who choose to live miles and miles from where they work so that their kids can go to a better school. If you can have, and housing is a separate component of that, and it's something else you'd have to deal with. But if people aren't choosing to live farther away from work so that they can send their kids to a better school, you've suddenly cut down on the amount of, on the number of trips, the amount of traffic that's happening in the region, and so there's a knock-on effect from that as well.
Guys, you were at the Casey event yesterday. You've seen Christie and Rubio and Cruz and others convention. What's your first-hand account so far as to seeing these people up close and what their message has been so far?
This is an excellent opportunity to plug my blog. KyleWingfield.blog.ajc.com. So actually, my column in tomorrow's paper is sort of an initial stab at dividing the field into 4 groups. And I have a top tier, a group not to be underestimated, a group not to be overestimated, and a bottom tier. Without giving away where everybody is in those tiers, so that you don't have to buy the paper or log on tomorrow. So Kasich is somebody that largely in part of largely based in what I heard from him yesterday, I think he's not to be underestimated. I think he's got a wealth of experience. There's some things about him that a lot of conservative voters are not going to like, his expansion of Medicaid. But at the same time, he was the budget committee chairman in the House the last time we balanced a budget in the federal government. So you can't really say he's not a fiscal hawk and a fiscal conservative and very tough-minded on that issue. I have Rubio in the top tier. I have Christie and Cruz in the not to be underestimated as well. So I guess we just haven't gotten the bad candidates coming through Georgia. I will, spoiler alert, out of 16, number 16 is Donald Trump. So,
So that's a sweet 16.
Sweet, sour, I don't know exactly how you want to characterize all of it.
Not to give away any of your other blog trade secrets, but can you talk in general terms about what you see being the right sort of candidate to run, what attributes we should be looking for? I mean, what are we going to need to pick up, Florida and Ohio?
Well, if I knew all the answers to that, I'd be making a lot more money as a political columnist. But I do think I favor governors over senators, first of all. I think the executive experience over the legislative experience, they're two very different roles. And I think there's something to be said for having had to make decisions in the executive role that a legislator, maybe a certain legislator turned president who's currently in office, didn't necessarily have. The weakness you could say there is that governors don't really deal with foreign policy, and maybe senators do. But most presidents are going to put together a team to help advise them on that. So that's one thing. I think that you've got to strike a balance between energizing your party base and not shooing away people who aren't part of that. For all the talk about how extreme the Republican Party has become, and we've nominated a couple of relative to the field they were in anyway, moderate candidates over the last couple of cycles, and they haven't won. Mitt Romney won the independent vote. He didn't win the presidency. So you've got to have someone that your base trusts and that independents will trust and find appealing to. And again, I don't have the magic formula for that. It's not as clear cut, obviously, as having executive experience or not. But I think that's, what I'll be looking at is, people talk about electability, and it means different things to different people. But I think it's having that balance between the people you have to have enthusiastic, and then the people who are going to show up and say, okay, yeah, I can vote for this person. You look like you were bidding, Charlie.
There's a limited degree that conservative-esque reforms can be implemented in the Atlanta public school system. But can you talk a little bit about, how we're trying to do that, or how outreach in that kind of area is going for Atlanta parents and stuff like that that might otherwise not hear Republican ideas?
I've long thought that school choice is the best issue for Republicans to reach out to people who don't traditionally vote Republican, because many of those people have the kids in the schools that they don't want them to be there and they don't have another way out. And this could be a real outreach and divide bridging, how should I say that? policy for the Republicans to pursue. One good, I mean, I will give the Atlanta School Board credit. There are a lot of charter school supporters on there, and there are a lot of charter schools in Atlanta. Now, there is a lot more demand for charter schools than there are seats available in them. There was a study I saw just last week, and Atlanta was among the top cities in the country for having the largest number of students on waiting lists for charter schools. I mentioned that my son goes to a charter school last spring, so 14, when they were having the initial lottery for that. And we're in Buckhead, so our school is not bad, and some of the schools in the area are quite excellent from an elementary standpoint anyway. There were 240 kids in the lottery for 50 slots for kindergarten. And a similar, it kind of went down gradually from there, but they were still oversubscribed in 8th grade. From what I understand, this spring for the second lottery, it was even more so. So there's a demand out there that's not being met. I think some of that the local school board can do, and I think this local school board, up to a point, is willing to do it. But I think there's a role for the state to do that too. The education of its citizens is a primary function of the state according to our Constitution. And one of the debates we'll have about the Opportunity School District is local control. Well, when the people that you granted local control to for decades have failed to use it in a way that benefits the citizens, I think you have to look at it from a standpoint of, okay, where's the accountability for that local control? And does the state need to do something on a temporary basis to bring things back into balance, and then you return to the local control after that? And I will also add, there's no control more local than that of a parent controlling their child's education. So when we have that debate, I'm fully ready to argue that, look, putting parents in charge of their kids' education is a vital form of local control. So,
Kyle, do you think the Republicans have too many candidates announcing?
yes.
That's called a rapid session.
I honestly don't know why some of these people are running.
Book
I
sales,
can't-
vice presidents.
I can't imagine all of them being able to write a book, but I guess this is what ghostwriters are for. There's too many, and it's going to be interesting when we get to the debates.
Comment on the danger of having some of the outlier candidates, like our Rick Santorum, who I don't think really shares some of the same ideas that anybody under 40 does. I don't mean to speak for everybody in here, but you can speak for me, and I worry about what some of the extremist social conservatives would say. So comment about the danger on having too many.
Well, I think some of that will depend on how tightly grouped the pack is, so to speak. I mean, if you've got a group of 3 or 4 who are sort of clearly above everybody else, I don't know how much damage the everybody else will really be able to inflict on them with comments or questions in a debate or that kind of thing. Now, one way is in the debates themselves, and the question about how to decide who gets to be in the debate. The first debate is August 6th, and we're going to have probably 16 declared candidates by then. You may have a few who know they wouldn't be invited to the debate, so they hold off declaring specifically so they can say, well, of course I wasn't invited. I'm not really a candidate yet. But Fox and CNN, which are the first 2 debates, have said you're only going to have 10 on a stage at one time. And CNN's gone so far as to say, well, we're going to have sort of two tables. There's going to be the adult table and the kids table. I sure wouldn't want to be at the kids table. And I'm real interested to hear what they're going to have to say in that debate about being in that position. I think you can solve that by grouping them in 4 or 5 people at a time and giving them a topic and letting them go, and the moderator just is there to make sure things don't go off the rails. I think the exposure that some of those lower tier candidates will gain at the expense of the upper tier candidates is maybe a way that happens. But I think we're going to see some separation. Oh, there already is some separation in the poll. I think that's only going to increase.
What do you think about Hillary's chances with the Democrats? Do you think someone like Obama could come in and maybe get her off as the front runner?
Bernie Sanders, I'm telling you, you heard it first. There doesn't seem to be anybody like that this go around. I don't think Martin O'Malley has got that kind of juice. It doesn't look like Elizabeth Warren is going to give it. She's the one person who I think could play that kind of role. But Hillary is tacking sufficiently left and populist, I think, to keep her from doing that. So I don't see that happening, but there's going to be a lot of material for whoever the Republican is to go after Hillary with. It's already, you can see it online every single day. There's something new. They arrested the soccer federation, the FIFA guys, today in Switzerland, and there was already a story about how FIFA donated to the Clinton Foundation. So they can't escape it, it seems like. And the Democrats may come to regret having a coronation instead of a primary, but I don't think there's anybody on that side who's going to stand there.
Just to follow up with that, what do you think is preventing a Democrat from jumping in the race? Like, if I were a Democrat, I would see the dead in the water, and I think this would be the perfect time to jump in the race.
They don't have a very deep bench. If you look, the Republicans have such an advantage of governors. Harry Reid is the leader in the Senate. He's, there's not a lot of people that you can think of right now who might have a chance. Well, I think you'll see some bad candidates get. You'll see. Jim Webb is in the race. Bernie Sanders is.
Anthony Weiner has the juice.
They just don't have a lot of people who I think are in the position to, at that point in their career, or they don't have the experience for it. So I have a hard time. Deval Patrick, from Massachusetts maybe, but he doesn't seem like he's willing to take that kind of a risk because, if you try to beat her this time after she's been denied once, and you don't succeed, you're going to be in real trouble. And so somebody like him who's relatively young, I think he bides his time. And, I'd love to see Harry Reid run for president.
I'm sorry. Do you think there's a candidate out there, the proper Republicans that can actually beat Hillary? Given the Clinton machine, fundraising, that's going to come in from Wall Street, and all these things that have come out really don't seem to stick. Her polling is still below 50%. What we have to prop up is she beatable. Given the proper chance you have.
It's going to take somebody who's running as somebody and not as I'm not Hillary. I think we had a primary 3 years ago where it was, I'm Mitt Romney, and then we had all the I'm not Mitt Romney, and then Romney ran as, I'm not Obama, and then that didn't work. I think you've got to have someone who is offering a coherent and complete vision, and I think if there's a good primary process, there are plenty of candidates who have the potential to offer that, and hopefully somebody will, and will win on that strength, rather than some of the other ways you can win elections. And if you have that going into the general election, I think she's very beatable. I really do. I think, head-to-head polling, when one party is so far from selecting, if you remember this time a year ago, I think Michelle Hunn was leading David Perdue and Jack Kingston head-to-head, coming out of the primary and going into the runoff, and we know how that turned out. So I think those kind of polls don't really tell us a lot at this point, and I think a newer face, and I'm not necessarily just talking age, but just newer, fresher in voters' minds, and someone with a positive agenda with real ideas and things they want to accomplish and not things they just want to be against. I think there are a few candidates who are positioned to offer that, and I think it would be really attractive. But obviously, I'm a little biased on that. So.
Talking about governors maybe not having as much foreign policy experience, what do you think about, just put the cart right before the horse, but like Lindsey Graham as a vice presidential candidate paired up with one of the stronger gubernatorial folks?
Him specifically or somebody else?
Well, him specifically, or somebody like that.
Or somebody else.
If Marco Rubio's not the nominee, I think you could see someone like him play up his foreign policy credentials that he's gained during his time in the Senate for that reason. I don't know. Did that help Obama in 2008 to have Joe Biden, who had a lot of foreign policy experience, mostly being wrong about foreign policy, on the ticket with him? I think that's debatable. There might be that, but honestly, anybody who's going to get to that position had better be ready to answer those questions on his or her own, and they better be putting a team around themselves right now to be able to do that, or else it's, But one thing that Cameron asked earlier about the candidates coming through the state, the one really consistent thing is that it seems like Republicans running for president think they can really make hay on the issue of foreign policy in this election. With everything that's going on in the world and the role that Hillary Clinton played as Secretary of State in getting us to that position. So I think you can try to balance the ticket that way, but I think the person on the top of the ticket has got to be. I don't think anybody would win without doing that, frankly. So.
But do you really think that that's an effective strategy if you point fingers and then what are your accomplishments?
Well, you're going to have to be ready to say what you would do differently and what you would do going forward. I mean, there's a number of situations around the world, ISIS, what Russia's been doing, what China does on various fronts, that the next president's going to have decisions to make. And I think it can't just be, well, it's Hillary's fault we're in this position. I think like everything else on all the other issues, you've got to be able to say, look, the current regime got us in this position, and here's how we get out. Here's what we do, and here's the positive, coherent message going forward.
Yeah, my question kind of plays off your question, your second question for all of us. I think you really pointed
I do have kids.
something that was striking though for the rest of us here. People aren't having kids, at least Republican voters aren't having kids. Conservatives aren't having a lot of children unless they're out, maybe some of the social conservatives Greg was talking about. But other than that, really,
If I could only get pregnant. Please don't live tweet that.
my question is, how do Republicans overcome the demographic sea change that is occurring? I mean, Republicans will come out in full force during the off presidential years, the whole Drudge Report demographic, listening to talk radio, hey, I'm mad as hell, I'm coming out, I'm going to vote, for opposition. But then, during the presidential election years, it's the whole, hey, rock the vote, get everybody out to vote, bus everybody in, only voted once, you have another civic duty, all that stuff. It just seems like it's just such a tidal wave in the last couple of presidential cycles. I mean, we could even go technically all the way back to 2000. It's just a tidal wave, a surge against Republicans. How do Republicans overcome this
persuade them to vote for it. I mean, I don't know of anything. I think it's that simple. Now, how you do that is not necessarily simple, but I think you've got to. I mean, look, if there's a large young generation coming into voting age and the age where they're, starting families and having jobs, if you're not getting them to vote for you, you're done. I mean, now how you go about doing that? But it's the same way you win any election. You get 50% plus one of the people casting votes to cast the vote for you. I think trying to write off certain sections of the electorate is a big mistake. You don't have to win 50% of every little group that's sliced up in an exit poll, but you can't lose 90% of them either. You've got to make slow and steady progress on lots of different fronts, and some of that means applying principles to different problems. Some of it means applying them in a different way. Some of it means talking about them in a different way. And some of it means just actually making the case to people that maybe have never heard the case before. So I think it's, like I said, there's lots of different ways to do it, but it's, persuasion, whichever way you go after it. You can't just decide, well, we're never going to get the young voters, or else you're done.
3 more questions.
Do you think any of these non-traditional candidates have a chance now or in the future? Like some that came along, like Reagan or Jesse Ventura, to serve as governor?
Interesting.
So do you have somebody in mind right now?
Fiorina?
So Fiorina is interesting, I think. She definitely seems to be focusing purely on attacking Hillary and trying to get, I think, in the number 2 slot on the ticket. And I mean, she may get there. I don't know. I think in certain years there's more of a chance of that, but in a year where you've got 2-term governors, past governors, senators who have a whole lot of name recognition and have built up a reputation already among people. So I think that's a tough. I think that's a tough task to pull off. Dr. Ben Carson is a brilliant man. We've elected 4 presidents in this country without prior political experience. All 4 were war heroes: Washington, Taylor, Grant, and Eisenhower. There's nobody in that mold in this field, and there's a first time for everything. But I think there's enough experience and depth of experience among the candidates that it will be more of a traditional candidate.
To change topics completely, could you talk a little bit about the Alex Johnson, Chip Paget, fight?
So that's actually something that I don't pay a whole lot of attention to, because I hate to tell everybody who spends a lot of time caring about it that most other people don't care about it. And we don't. I think, so this is 2 straight election cycles within the party where there's been this split, right? And I think it's pretty clear that if somebody doesn't figure out a way to get everybody, rowing in the same direction, eventually it's a problem. It's arguably already a problem in that you have some outside third-party groups doing a lot of the work that you traditionally think of a political party doing for its own candidates. So to that degree, I pay attention to it just for what it kind of tells me about the mood of the people who are most active in the party. But beyond that, it's inside baseball. Yeah, it's kind of inside baseball. I mean, it matters to the degree that you get everybody, like I say, moving in the same direction within the party. The people are going to be the most active in the campaign. But
so that's why you didn't write a blog about it at Galilee to illustrate the infight.
He's the political insider, so he was in the inside story.
Just like to explain it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he that's his audience, and I have a little different.
All right, you mentioned Fiorina. She's never held office. Is it realistic? I don't know. If Hillary's going to be the nominee, if Republicans put up 2 white guys, and Rubio is basically a white guy, do they have any chance? I mean, Republicans respectively don't like Indian politics, but the country kind of digs it. Are we done if we have 2 white guys?
If it's a white guy at the top of the ticket, I think that's got to be a consideration.
That's our track.
For who? I mean, that to me more than the foreign policy experience kind of thing, just because of the visibility of that running mate that's probably a more important consideration. If I'm putting that together, I mean, I hear a name I hear a whole lot for those reasons. Is Susana Martinez, the governor of New Mexico, who I thought gave a great speech at the convention in 2012 and is conspicuously quiet during this whole process right now, almost as if that's what she's kind of expecting to be, on somebody's short list as well. So, I think if it's Scott Walker and Jeb Bush against Hillary Clinton and Julian Castro, it's probably not a good look. Is that 3?
That was 3.
Get one more. You should do your first one after. You're welcome.
My firstborn is named Charlie. Just like him. Actually, we named him, and then it turned out we had a Charles on both sides of the family we didn't even know about. So we made everybody happy completely unwittingly. So if you can pull that off, I highly recommend it.
Sure. Totally off topic of anything we've talked about, but what's your take on the minimum wage debate? There's a lot of cities in the West Coast that have recently upped it to $15 an hour, which is incredibly higher than anything we're seeing here. What's your take on how that plays into the Atlanta economy, especially being it's a liberal city in a larger conservative state?
I think if you want to see the unemployment rate spike, that's what you do. I mean, I think if you want to see further automation of jobs that are entry level, bottom of the ladder, but allow you to get on the ladder and start climbing up the ladder, those kind of jobs, that's what you do. I think economics, I think I have to provide a certain amount of value to my company, or else it doesn't make sense for them to hire me. And if it was clear that people in minimum wage jobs were doing $15 an hour worth of work, I think they'd be earning something closer to $15 an hour. I don't buy the idea that there's, greed or something else is just taking money away that they're actually contributing to the company. You can slice the numbers a lot of different ways, but these tend to be entry-level jobs. They're not intended to be careers. You're intended to get that job, get some experience, and move up and make more money. As long as people are doing that, I think we should care less about what the wage is when they grab that first rung of the ladder, and more about how many rungs, how far it is to get to the next rung, and how many more rungs there are, and how crowded it is trying to climb up that ladder, the availability of jobs and that sort of thing. That's a far better thing to focus on.